Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, tens of thousands rally across the nation demanding equality and justice for women.
My story was on the front page for the sole reason that it is a painful reminder to women that if it can happen in Parliament House, it can truly happen anywhere.
Indigenous justice advocates despair after 3 deaths in custody in less than a week, 30 years on from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. Where's the action? And as the government urges a domestic travel blitz, there's still much uncertainty about just when the international borders will open. Joining me on the panel, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Strategy and Services at the University of Sydney, Lisa Jackson-Pulver. Good to see you. Also on the desk tonight, founder of Pep Talk Her, a platform that aims to close the gender pay gap, Maggie Palmer. Lovely to see you in the country.
You as well.
In Canberra, political editor at news.com.au, Sam Maiden. Thanks for making time on a busy day. And coming to us from Brisbane, we're pleased to introduce journalist and co-host of the investigative podcast The Curtain, Amy Maguire. Hi, Amy.
Hello.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. It's less than 2 months since sexual assault survivor Grace Tame was named Australian of the Year. Since then, the country has been embroiled in an intense national debate over the treatment of women in politics, at school, even in the ADF. We've heard accusations that Parliament is a toxic workplace, that it's unsafe for women. And we've confronted questions over a culture that enables abusers to act with impunity. All of that momentum has taken us to this moment.
Tens of thousands of women and allies in over 40 locations are taking to the streets of Australia today to say enough is enough.
We are all here today, not because we want to be here, but because we have to be here. 1 out of every 5 women in Australia will be sexually assaulted or raped in their lifetime. And if you're a woman of colour, those statistics are even higher.
Justice! Now!
I'm absolutely sick of listening to sexual assault on the TV and nothing's been done about it.
I think finally women in Australia have had enough.
We are here today for the girls hiding under the covers, listening to the approaching footsteps.
It's happening in schools, in universities, in offices, and everybody I know is angry.
Enough is enough!
I was raped inside Parliament House by a colleague, and for so long it felt like the people around me only cared because of where it happened and what it might mean for them.
Brittany will not be silenced. Victim survivors will not be silenced. Not on our watch. Not now. Not ever.
Enough is enough!
We are here on behalf of the refugee women who have been raped and abused.
Even though I was born free and equal, as a young woman I was sold. Can you believe that in this country I was sold by my foster father to a 70-year-old man?
We say no more. No more.
The women, united, will never be defeated.
Fearlessness is not so much an absence of fear. It's a refusal to let it stop us moving forward.
Enough is enough. It's time to take action right here, right now.
Lisa, you're sitting there taking deep breaths.
Yeah.
How are you feeling tonight?
Well, you would have thought that after generations and generations and generations, women receiving the vote, having opportunities, apparently, for equal pay and for justice, and here we are still having to share our stories. I don't know about you, but there is not a woman I know that has not been sexually assailed, abused, physically abused, used, or in deep fear, and has been once or twice or more times in their life. We all have stories, and I think the uprising of us all together and hearing those voices and just watching the introduction there has really made me feel that...
Feel what? Feel angry? Despair?
Absolutely. This is a reckoning. You know, we've used that word before about a number of things, but there are so many parts of the world that we live in. In my world, in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody, which we'll be talking about shortly, whether it's with women's justice, whether it's with refugee rights, whether it's with our beloved environment that cares for us and that looks after us and that will sustain us. This is a reckoning that's coming, and it's approaching us on so many fronts, and we have to take a breath and say, when is enough enough? What has to happen before we start to have some common sense about the world that we're in and the people that we share this world with and the respect that is deserved? These are not crazy kooky stories of a long time ago. These are real stories happening now.
Amy, the Labor Indigenous MPs went out in force today. We saw them lining up. There were Liberal MPs as well out today in Canberra. But it's a movement that's been predominantly ignited by non-Indigenous women. And I wonder how you felt, Amy, about this sudden rage about gendered inequality.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to be cynical coming from for Aboriginal women to be cynical. I'll just give an example. Tanangia Women's Safety Group in 2018 actually held a sorry ceremony outside Parliament House. And I think outside of one report from the ABC's Indigenous Affairs reporter, Bridget Brennan, it largely went, completely unannounced and in silence. And then Malcolm Turnbull refused to meet them when he was up in Alice Springs. So we see this continually, that when Aboriginal women speak out against violence, we're totally ignored and then accused of being complicit in this constructed silence. And so I think it comes down to, there's a lot of talk about inclusion and including Aboriginal women's voices. It actually has to be centred. That's very different, because if you look at the history of this country, the sexual violence, it's a part of the settler colonial project. And you can't actually see the layers of violence unless you look at the long history and Aboriginal women as predominantly the victims of this violence. You're not going to see it comes out in the responses, the carceral responses that end up ultimately hurting Aboriginal women further. And so that's why there's a problem with this universalisation of a woman's experience. We actually have to look at differences, and we can only do that not by inclusion, by centering Aboriginal women's experiences, not just testimony, but our theorisation of our own experiences of violence and what's actually happening in this country.
Sam, you brought us the Brittany Higgins story, and I think that motivated a lot of women today right around the country to join those marches. And Brittany spoke of the same stale, tired fight, a sense of almost despair. With the anger, women assaulted in Parliament House, sexual assault in aged care, the vulnerability of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander women, the vulnerability of people with a disability, and just this roar of enough. I mean, you were there. Is it anger? Is it despair? What's driving it?
Well, it was a very powerful moment, and it was very moving watching her return to the workplace where she had very difficult experiences. There was a couple of really interesting things that I thought were in her speech, which picks up some of the threads of our earlier discussions, which is that, she admits that she has advantages, for want of a better word, that many victims don't, right? And she is, for want of a better term, I know this sounds terrible, she's a very good victim, right? She's white, she's middle class, she's very articulate, she's very educated. And she's the sort of victim that people naturally feel a lot of great emotion for. But the point that she made in her speech today was there are many people that don't have those advantages, that don't necessarily have their cases treated in the same way. And I'm not suggesting that her case has been treated particularly well either, but she did actually raise that issue. She talked about women of colour and how they were more likely to experience different things. She did talk about those things, and I think that's part of a broader debate that we're going to have in Australia and a broader discussion which is already happening in New South Wales and elsewhere around consent laws and what change actually looks like.
Well, today's protests were organised by Melbourne academic Janine Hendry, and among her demands is that the government implement the 55 recommendations from the Respect at Work report that is now more than a year old.
The Women of Australia want some action. We're drawing a line in the sand right here, right now.
Okay. All right.
you'll give me that assurance?
Well, I'm certain that we'll absolutely look at it. I can't give you the assurance that we'll...
I'm not interested in you looking at it. You've been looking at this for years. I'm sorry, it's time, and it's time now. We don't want any more reports.
Sure.
We want change, and we want change now. You've had that report for 14 months. It's time.
Understand.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Some MPs attended the march in Canberra, as I said, including Labor leader Anthony Albanese. Scott Morrison offered to meet with Hendry inside Parliament House after the march, but that offer was rejected.
Can I just urge you, please, take the opportunity to come and meet with the Prime Minister and the Minister for Women. World leaders come into this building and take up that opportunity to meet with the Prime Minister. The fact that you've been invited is really, really exciting. Please grasp the nettle and take that opportunity.
For more, we're joined in Canberra by Janine Hendry. Janine, thank you for making time for us on this busy day. We're going to show, as I asked the first question, a wonderful series of photographs of you hugging Brittany Higgins today. She's wearing white in contrast to a crowd wearing mostly black. Now, why were you so keen for the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers to come outside and listen to Brittany and to the other speakers rather than to go inside Parliament House to his office?
I felt that the women of Australia had made their way to the lawns of Parliament House, and they were standing on the footsteps of Parliament, wanting their voices to be heard. And fundamentally, we've got huge issues of respect of women in this country, and that's been demonstrated by the Prime Minister and his Cabinet Minister's response to the alleged rape of Brittany Higgins inside of Parliament. And I thought, out of respect for the women that have come in protest to the Parliament House, the least the Prime Minister could have done was come out and listen to the voices of those women. Mm.
And we saw Jane Hume there. I mean, extraordinary day, walking up and down the corridors, running into the Deputy Prime Minister, who said, we'll have a look at the report Respect at Work done by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner. You had that same smile on your face when you were talking to him.
I'm not sure that he has actually had a look at it. I don't think he liked being reminded that it had been sitting on the Attorney-General's desk for 14 months.
It really is an extraordinary... Can we just actually go to it? You know, 55 recommendations that would turn the workplaces of Australia on their head. I've got details of it here. You talk amongst yourselves while I find it. Here it is. If the Fair Work Commission could make orders to stop sexual harassment at work, like they stop bullying the government, departments would all have to publish gender equality indicators, including not only the ratio of men to women in the workplace and their pay and the salary gap, but how many use flexible work arrangements, how many men or women come back from parental leave after 12 months and so forth. A wholesale change to the Sex Discrimination Act, listed companies required to address sexual harassment, you know, on and on and on. The sort of things that would put the pressure not on the complainants, not on the victims, but on businesses in this country to be accountable for this. Did you get the sense when you were wandering the corridors that anyone had had a read?
No. In short, that was not my overwhelming conclusion at all. I think it was just another report, and that was my point when I spoke to Michael McCormack. We don't need another report. The information is there. We just want to see it implemented. I mean, this is 2021. I mean, why am I even standing up there? Really, I mean, I was marching in the 1980s. Why am I doing it 40 years down the track? It's shocking. I mean, Australia's a first world country, and yet our laws around equality and affirmative action are 20 years out of date.
Maggie, can I turn to you? The Prime Minister noted in question time in Parliament that the peaceful protest was, quote, right and just, and he also said that in other countries, protesters were being shot at.
Yeah, bizarre.
when he said that. Did you think that was bizarre? I just found it like, should I be grateful? I marched today and I was like, should I be grateful that I didn't like get a bullet? Like, I just don't understand what he was getting at there. And frankly, I found question time today quite offensive. I felt that the government tried to bat away the issue that is front of mind for everyone today around the country. Like, we're sick of it. And I just didn't feel that in question time today, we got the respect that we're looking for and that we're demanding. I just don't think they're taking this seriously still. To your point, you know, in 2021, I'm at a loss.
Why not? I mean, the Prime Minister said right and just. The Prime Minister talked about the sorts of programs his government is implementing for gender equality. What was it about that sort of didn't sound authentic to you?
Well, I mean, it was just like they were asking, we saw questions asked to them about the march today, and then they would basically ignore it and come out with, you know, answering a Dorothy Dixer, and it just didn't sit right with me today. You know, we've got thousands of women around Australia marching, reliving trauma from their past, sharing stories of things that have happened to them, and I just feel like they didn't read the room. I just thought it was completely tone deaf, and, you know, exactly what you said earlier, you know, those recommendations in the report, that's the change that we want. You know, I think it was Susan Ley today mentioned in passing, you know, the Female Founders Fund and a few other things, and she said something like, you know, we're letting women reach for the stars. I found it patronising. I was offended, frankly, watching it.
Sam Maiden, the Minister for Women, Anne Rushton, said that she was going to do the work to advocate for gender equality inside the building today, and she didn't need to go outside the building. She didn't have time to go outside the building, and she spent 20 minutes doing an interview on Sky explaining why she didn't have time to go to the protest. And that seemed to be a line from the government today. I just wonder your reflections on that.
Well, there were Liberal women that turned up, to be fair.
Yes.
There were, and there was a number of women, I think more than people thought, that turned up. I know that Maurice Payne was photographed in the Senate at the time. Look, I mean, personally, I would have thought it would have been great if more women from the Liberal Party had turned up. You know, I think some women, the Liberals, Amanda Stoker has suggested this is sort of a bit of a partisan thing. Well, it would be less partisan if more Liberals turned up, right? And at the end of the day, the Liberal staffer, Brittany Higgins, who was, you know, a big trigger point for all of this, she worked for the Liberal Party, right? And, you know, she's not a member of the Labor Party. She's not trying to make this partisan. She wants change, you know, for all women. It's not a party political issue. This is something that concerns the Greens and everyone, really.
I think I misspoke there. She's not the Minister for Women, is she? Is she Families and Social Services? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's hard to keep up myself because they keep changing it. I think it may be Maurice Payne at the moment, but who could be sure?
OK, but she wasn't at the march, and the Prime Minister wasn't at the protest in front of me. Amy, can I turn to you? What do you think? Is this a moment? You know, later in the program we're going to talk about Aboriginal deaths in custody and that key moment of 1991, and I want to talk to you about this moment. So Brittany talks about this confronting sense of banality and the horrible societal acceptance in Australia of sexual violence against women. And then you have the women, the female president and secretary of the ACTU going, we're unstoppable. We're cutting through like a sword, enough is enough. And that anger, Amy, combined with a demand for change brings change. Do you believe that, Amy?
I mean, I hope so. As I said before, I can be quite cynical about this. I think it feels like a moment, and obviously the anger, the distress, obviously so many women see themselves in what is currently happening. But it is very easy to feel cynical in relation to Aboriginal women particularly, because if it's not about silence, complete apathy, ignorance, it's about seizing on the violence perpetrated against Aboriginal women for political purposes. And I must also say Liberal and Labor have been complicit in that, as have white women historically and currently. You only have to look at the anti-intervention. And when I talk about, you know, sometimes it can feel that it can be quite dangerous when we look at this sort of outrage, because it leads to carceral responses. An example of this is the debate around family violence and looking at criminalising coercive control without actually looking at the complexities of that legislation, the impact it could have on Aboriginal women who are already targeted as aggressors, and seeing them not as important parts of the debate but seeing them as sort of just, you know, to be included, to be listened to in the same way that, you know, the stats about violence against Aboriginal women are just tacked on at the end of articles as an afterthought. So I'm quite cynical, and sometimes when we see outrage and momentum around these movements centred on, you know, a white upper middle class victim, and that's not to take away from the distress and the anger and the grief that a lot of Australian women are feeling today, but it can also feel quite dangerous for us because of the circumstances, and that's why I say we have to centre Aboriginal women to understand the layers of violence, not just at an interpersonal level, but state-sanctioned violence that is seen as legitimate at Aboriginal women who are in the intersections of race, racism, sexism and class and disability, you know, all of these different oppressions that are fundamentally different from non-Indigenous women. And that's where it can become quite scary in a sense, but that's not to take away from, you know, the momentous march that happened today, but it's just to say that we also have to centre the victims of really horrendous state-sanctioned violence that is currently being perpetrated against Aboriginal women now and historically.
Yeah, Lisa, is there... that's a really nuanced point she's making. Is there a risk of, you know, you look at the statistics, and the Prime Minister said today Aboriginal women are 34 times more likely to be hospitalised than non-Indigenous women. Is there a risk that you slice and dice the demographic a little bit here with these mass movements?
Yep. So a lot of what worries me is that things all get conflated into one big thing. And then it's going to be like the majority thing is the thing that people hear, and you still lose those really important voices that make all the distinctions. The other thing about that sort of data is that it almost removes the concrete nature of how human beings interact and engage. So every 3 women out of 5 are currently in a situation or have in the last 4 or 5 years been in a situation that. Now, that's something I've just made up, but my point is that we need to translate that data and information into something that people can touch and feel. You know, things like being able to recognise that at the moment, incarceration, people say Aboriginal people are incarcerated 12 times the rate of non-Aboriginal people. So what you need to say is if the Aboriginal population was the same as the non-Aboriginal population, then how many Aboriginal people would you have in jail if that was to be standardised? And you would be talking about hundreds of thousands more than what is there. So we need to get these data concrete and real so that people can really grip up what it means. It's a bit too abstract.
And that has consequences, obviously, Janine, when we're talking about how institutions, including the police, deal with survivors, people who come forward to talk about their experience of sexual abuse. Now, according to Mick Fuller, New South Wales Police Commissioner, of the 100% of complainants who go to police, which is probably only 1 in 10 victims, so of the 100% who actually go forward, only 10% proceed to court, and of that 10%, of the whole that proceed to court, only 10% of those result in convictions. And yet the Prime Minister says today, points to this issue that we have with the justice system. Quote, as terribly difficult as it must be, says Scott Morrison, going to the police and making a complaint is the only way to achieve justice and to ensure the perpetrator can no longer harm anyone else.
Yeah. There's got to be another way, and I made the point today that we need structural change within all of our institutions if we're going to address this, because clearly what we're doing now is not working. The number of convictions is something like 0.02%, and that's of the people who actually make a claim. So there's huge structural inequities, and when we look at it cross-culturally and look at the different needs, and we're talking about our First Nations people and the issues specifically that they face, we've got to address these issues if we're going to move forward. And fundamentally, all of these issues stem back to equality.
Amy, in 2018, I read a statistic, there were at least 6,741 untested rape kits sitting in crime labs and police officers in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland alone. In Victoria, Amy, almost 5,000 rape kits were submitted as evidence between 2011 and 2018. Less than half of those kits had been tested. What is the experience of Indigenous women and their likelihood to approach police and report sex crimes?
Yeah, I mean, this is a historical issue as well. It all leads back to the role of policing in the settler colonial project. But there's been a really a fear of police, because police, in a sense, are the site of violence in itself. And, you know, later we're going to be talking about the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. In the same year, there was a report done by Hiriok into racism in Australia, but in relation to when it comes to Aboriginal mob who they talked to, most of it had to do with police. And there were a lot of testimonies given by Aboriginal women talking about being harassed, being the victim of sexual violence, being threatened with rape by police in 1991 in that report. And so there's a real fear of approaching police, and that has a historical basis behind it, because police were involved not only in the massacres, but during the assimilationist era, they were the ones, basically, you know, the enforcers of so many of these horrendous policies that controlled the lives of Aboriginal people. And so when we talk about reform, we're not talking about reform. Like, police are violent. This institution is violent and racist in itself. And so carceral responses are something that we don't even want to look at, you know, in relation to Aboriginal mob, because we've seen how the justice system is so brutal and compounds.
Yeah, looks like Amy's just frozen there. We'll re-establish that Skype line. If I could turn to you, Maggie, who is all this directed at? I mean, yes, there were men and women in the protest movements today, but, I mean, who is it directed at? Grace Tame said men are not the enemy, corrupt behaviour is. Yeah. Saxon Mullins, a young woman who was the complainant in a highly publicised rape trial who campaigns on consent and law reform, told the Canberra Process, they are your friends from school, your footy mates. Where do you think they're hiding? Do you laugh when somebody says, don't be so sensitive, a woman complaining about sexist language? She talked about a toxic culture of misogyny. Who's supposed to be convinced by today?
Well, I think it's really interesting. So I remember at the Women's March a few years ago, there was very few men, whereas today, when I was marching, I'd say maybe 10% of the crowd probably identified as male. Like, so I think there were quite a lot of allies there, which is awesome, and I think we need to see more and more of that, because this is not just a women's problem. This is not a women's problem. In fact, this is something that happens to women. Do you know what I mean? I think it is that general awareness that we need from men, from parents, talking to their children from a young age. You know, I spoke at an all-girls school the other day, and some of the girls came up to me afterwards and told me sometimes they do classes with the guys' school, and they are told not to wear singlets. They should put a jumper on because it might, I don't know, make the male students a little bit frisky or whatever. During class.
Sexual education class or
No,
any class?
this is just like history class or English class. Sometimes they combine forces, and they even now, in modern Australia, this is what young girls are being told in high school.
And just finish that thought. What does that do to a young woman? What does that say to her about whose fault it is if she's victimised?
Exactly. It says that it's our fault. It's my fault for wearing a singlet. It's my fault for wearing a short dress. It's my fault for having a few drinks. We never talk about the fact that why is it not the perpetrator's fault? Like, why is there no responsibility put back onto the other gender? And I think that's part of the conversation that needs to change, and that courage and leadership needs to come from the top. And we've had courageous women who've come forward sharing horrendous stories, something that, you know, that was what they will be known for forever. That is such courage to come forward and share that experience. And then not to see that courageous leadership from the top is just so deflating to me and so disappointing. And I think that's where it has to start. Until we see that from our federal politicians, it's got to come from there. I just think that without that, we're going to be taking a lot longer than the 100 years that the UN Women says that it's going to take for equality already.
Janine, you sent the, what was it, 99,000 signatures today to Parliament saying, please get on and do something about that sex discrimination report, Respect at Work. Please always investigate sex crimes. It was just 4 simple requests. Any response?
No response thus far, but I think we need to tackle this issue from both directions. We need to have some behavioural and cultural change, and I think it's really important that people start feeling empowered to call out bad behaviour, because that is part of the issue. And if we can attack this from the bottom and also work with some systemic and structural change at the top, then we've got a greater chance of actually getting there. And we need to stop this victim blaming. We need to stop saying that a woman is responsible for her own sexual assault. That kind of stuff's got to get called out. And when we've got it coming from people in positions of power and people who have power over other people, then we've got a huge problem in this country, and it needs to be addressed really quickly. I mean, I don't know how any senior minister can show their face on the global stage when the kind of statistics that are coming out of Australia in relation to sexual assault of women is just horrific. And, you know, I know from the interviews that I've done over the last 48 hours that this is getting enormous amount of international press. Yes. We had live feeds there today into the BBC. This was all over the BBC, Sunday night news, and right through the United States. So, yeah, I think there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure on this government as a result of the rallies today. I hope so.
Yeah. Quick final comment, Lisa.
This is the tip of an iceberg.
Yeah.
And this is absolutely family business, community business, colleague business. It is something which threatens to destructure so much if we're not brave enough to grip it up and recognise that this is everybody's business to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. And just one last one, Sam, and we should have spent more time on it, but Labor, you've broken another story today. A group of women on Facebook, all former Labor staffers, talking about the sort of harassment and bad behaviour that they've received from, I guess, Labor MPs. Now, Anthony Albanese said those are anonymous and therefore he can't do anything till people come forward. What's your view on that?
Well, it's not just Labor MPs, of course. They're talking about a culture within the organisation involving staff-to-staff kind of harassment and things like that. Look, I think that what it goes to show is this is a society-wide problem, right? And I think that there's been a real feeling among Labor women and female staffers in the ALP that they want to talk about these issues for a long time. They've led a lot of internal stuff about having conversations about this. I don't know if it's fair to say Anthony Albanese is saying he can't do anything. He actually said, you know, come forward. There are processes that we've put in place. Right. I would encourage you to do all of that. But, you know, what it tells you is that this is not a problem that is just the Liberal Party or just the Labor Party or the Greens. It's a society-wide problem, and it's a problem in Parliament House, no matter what party that you're a member of.
Extraordinary day, Janine, extraordinary day, all from one tweet saying, what do you think about the idea of joining hands around Parliament? And we saw it in every city and every town. What an extraordinary thing. Thanks for making time for us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Janine Hendry was the March for Justice organiser today. These conversations can be really difficult to have, and if you need to speak to anyone, call Lifeline on 13 11 14, 1800 RESPECT on 1800 737 732. You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Strategy and Services at the University of Sydney, Lisa Jackson-Pulver, founder of Pep Talk Her, Maggie Palmer, in Canberra, political editor at news.com.au, Sam Maiden, and in Brisbane tonight, journalist and co-host of The Curtain podcast, Amy Maguire. Almost 30 years ago, Australia was in the midst of another moment. A movement for change that was ignited by a community's refusal to accept the status quo. The 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody came about following the deaths of 99 Indigenous people in custody. Most of the report's recommendations have not been taken up. Since then, the number of deaths in custody has soared to at least 440, including 3 more deaths in less than a week just this month. The Drum's Stephanie Bolchi has been looking back 3 decades to when the Royal Commission was released, and a warning. The following contains images of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have since died.
The final report of the Black Deaths Royal Commission slates Australia as a racist society.
The report makes 339 recommendations for change.
History will record that the Royal Commission has played a vital role in laying open before us the harshness and oppression experienced by so many contemporary Aboriginal Australians.
In the 10 months since its damning report, little has changed. A further 20 Aborigines have died in custody.
It's very disappointing, 10 years on, that, as I say, we're still having deaths in custody. Our young people are still going into prison at an alarming rate.
Every single death always gets swept under the carpet. What do we have to do to stop this?
Now Patrick Dodson, one of its authors, has this aching assessment. The situation is worsening.
Accepting the status quo permits the criminal justice system to continue to suck us up like a vacuum cleaner and deposit us like waste in custodial institutions.
My son was looking forward to getting out of jail and starting a new life. But he died at the hands of screws and begging for his breath.
At that time, there were 99 deaths that we were concerned about in this nation to effect a national Royal Commission. Now we've got over 400 deaths since that Royal Commission. And we have 30 years that have passed that have not addressed the underlying issues.
Budget Estimates has revealed a 44-year-old Indigenous woman died by an apparent suicide, and days earlier, a 35-year-old Indigenous man died in the Long Bay Prison Hospital.
2 deaths in 1 week, and you decide not to tell the public.
Most tragically, and yes, I have not informed the public, I have informed all the oversight bodies. I would suggest that it is not appropriate for us to simply advise the public in the absence of any detail that we can provide and cause a lot of anger, a lot of angst and a lot of grief that already, no doubt, exists.
And since that comment was made, another man has died while in custody in Victoria. Amy, can I start with you on this? We just heard the Corrective Services Commissioner there saying people don't want to know, it causes a lot of anger, a lot of angst. Who doesn't want to know, Amy?
Definitely, I guess, the system. I mean, a lot of work has been done by Aboriginal mob, mostly families of victims of death in custody, to actually make this visible in the first place. And a big part of it is that there's never been accountability. There are deliberate attempts to stop justice and any form of justice for Aboriginal families. And we see that there's been an uphill battle in order to just get the little semblance of justice that we have in some cases. For the most part, there's an obscuring of accountability completely. When we talk about death in custodies, we talk about all of the deaths, all of the numbers, but we never talk about the perpetrators. You know, and I think that's one of the key parts. There's an obscuring of the perpetrator because when an Aboriginal person goes into custody, they're automatically seen as criminals, they're automatically seen as less than, they're automatically seen as inhuman. And so the deaths at the hands of the justice system are seen as legitimate, and Australia, for the whole part, doesn't care. And it's a problem of the system. It's not about holes in the system, it's the system working, and it's worked since day one in relation to the, you know, the invasion of Aboriginal lands. Incarceration is about containment and about keeping blackfellas out of sight. And so I'm not shocked at all that there are these deliberate attempts to keep the deaths of our loved ones secret, because we see it continually in this process, even in the coronial process, you know, where we're constantly fighting in order to get the right questions asked.
You know, you've made the point in relation to the George Floyd, the uprising, the Black Lives Matter movement that came out of that in the United States and globally, that, you know, he was killed on camera and we all bore witness to it. But there's so much CCTV footage. You've made this point of Aboriginal deaths in custody, and that must be an enormously difficult thing for families to do, to say, here's the CCTV of my relative being degraded and dying, and that's on the internet for all time. And yet it doesn't seem to have the impact. We don't seem to have the names on the tip of our tongue.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the enormous burden that is placed on Aboriginal families, not just to advocate, but to put the wounds of their loved ones out for the world to see, and still see this ignorance and this apathy. And I've been thinking a lot about the CCTV footage, because when I look at that, when I look at Miss Dew, Mr. Briscoe, all of these cases, Miss Day, I see violence in that footage, and I think, how can they not see that? You know, Mr. Briscoe, you see blood on the floor. But I've been thinking about it. Even the footage of George Floyd over in America, there has been other footage of police brutality caught on tape that sometimes does not create the same level of outrage. And it's about actually the work that's been done to make this violence visible. And that's not to say that it hasn't been done over here. Aboriginal families are continually fighting to make it happen. But Australians deliberately do not want to see it, and sometimes they cannot see it because they have been conditioned to believe the violence perpetrated against us is legitimate, and so they can't see it. And that's the only way I can, still seeing Aboriginal men, women and children as unworthy of mourning, unworthy of grief, and fundamentally unworthy of justice is a real problem. And I think the other point to make is that when these statements come out from corrections or police talking about causes of death, they're always couched in terms that deny adequate questioning around accountability, stuff about suicide, about natural causes. When you actually go and look at the coronial inquest and you talk to families, you see all these layers of structural violence. Nathan Reynolds, the inquest into the death in custody of Nathan Reynolds saw, complete adequate failure to respond to his cries for help, and he died of asthma, and his friends inside prison were the ones who were helping him. He should never had to have died. And so you see all of these bureaucratic language that work to obscure the violence that is being perpetrated against Aboriginal people. I see this language of natural causes, this language of suicide. There is nothing natural about dying in custody. And the other point to make is so many Aboriginal people are locked up for no crime at all, particularly Aboriginal women. Many of them are on remand. Many of them were just about to get out. And so I see all these debates about, almost like victim blame. They deserved it because they are locked up. No one deserves that. These deaths are not natural, and we are doing the work to make that violence visible, and we need Australia to be outraged.
Yeah, it's powerful.
It's powerful.
And as you were just saying as we were watching that video, very triggering for a lot of people in the community, this whole conversation tonight. There's Amy talking about Mr. Briscoe. 2012. He's committed no crime. He's really drunk. He's taken into protective custody in Alice Springs to the Watch House. And the coroner says that his supervision and treatment by the Northern Territory Police is completely inadequate. It's, quote, utterly derelict. The coroner says his death is preventable and should not have occurred. Amy's talked about Nathan Reynolds, died of asthma. She's talked about Ms. Dew, who had broken ribs and was getting pneumonia, was calling out for help in the Watch House. Unpaid fines. Tanya Day, again, just drunk. The Royal Commission had said, don't put people in jail. And yet, in a newsroom, what happens is, the news came through last week, another death in custody. And then a line comes through, natural causes, and we all go, ooh, what do we do? Well, is there any such, what?
Natural causes of asthma, when someone's held on the ground and it takes, how long, 22 minutes to seek help. The issue that we have with many of the prisons is that they almost come the default place for people to go, rather than mental health institutions or other kinds of health facilities. We've got people that are diabolically unwell that are living in a prison that can only get health care at the governor's pleasure, or words to that effect. So why aren't they in hospital, or why aren't they in a place where they can get the proper medication and the proper treatment so that they can become well? And this is not an unknown thing that's only dropped out of the sky in the last 10 years. This has been going on for decades and decades and decades, and still people are putting people into prison rather than diverting them into a health system that should be theirs for the taking as Australian citizens.
OK, and so for people watching at home who say, well, if you're taken into protective custody,
you would expect that you would be not only just fed and given somewhere safe to sleep at night and have a shower every day, but that you would get the treatment that you need for your existing conditions or any new conditions that arise.
And if you're not going to get that assistance in jail, and this is happening over and over again, what is the purpose of taking somebody into protective custody? Is it just to keep them out of sight? I mean, what is the point of it?
Oh, look, I might go with Amy on that one and just say people just what's not seen is not known. Is that what we're looking at? Are Australians that weird that they just can't see what's before them? You know, we've got 230 plus years of injustices. We've got lots and lots of people that are in prison and they themselves or their parents or their grandparents were forcibly removed from their homes and families as stolen generations. I mean, that certainly came out in Sir Ronald Wilson's report. We have got people that have been dispossessed and dislocated from family, culture, community, land, highly urbanised people. We've got people that are just not treated well enough to be able to get jobs even though they might be fabulously qualified and really hard workers. You've got all of this institutional racism that puts a filter when they see somebody before them. And it's either they have a very poor practice and throw them in jail, or they have very poor practice and not give them a job when they're absolutely the best person for the job, or when they're sick, just somehow that person's not deserving of treatment and care. Now, is this okay for a modern day Australian society? We're a really rich nation. Somehow we've managed to got a large proportion of the prison population is with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We're one of the richest nations on earth and we cannot seem to have the guts and the bravery and the courage to take the steps that are needed that Aboriginal leaders have been writing for decades that we need to take to make a difference.
Sam Maiden, can I turn to you? You know, we were speaking in our earlier discussion and Janine was saying to the Deputy Prime Minister, we don't want another report. We don't want another report. And if we look back at the Black Deaths in Custody Royal Commission report, we've heard on this program another Deputy Prime Minister of the country, John Anderson, former Nationals leader, who's talking about making another run at politics. And he said on this program that even though he was the Deputy Prime Minister for 8 years, he'd never read the Black Deaths in Custody Royal Commission report. He never read it. I don't know, is there a question there? I don't know what to say about that. And why, when you and I as journalists, you know, Mr Briscoe, who Amy referred to in the Alice Springs Watch House, was dragged across the floor by his arm. And the coroner had to say, you know, dragging detainees is unacceptable. But there's pictures of that, there's footage of that. Why doesn't it cut through to us, do you think?
Well, on some level, it's because I think that people have this conception of it as being the other, right? So there is some conception in the Australian populace, which is, you know, based in racism, that this is something that happens to someone else, not us. Does that make sense? So these are people that are arrested when they're very, very drunk and, gee, that wouldn't happen to me. Now, there are lots of communities that have gone about, you know, essentially decriminalising people that are found intoxicated, for example, but that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily brought in. But look, if you're asking me why John Anderson hasn't read that report, I can't answer that question for you. But I think that a lot of it is to do with this idea of conceiving of people in these situations, just as we've had this debate in relation to rape in days gone by, as is in some way complicit with what happens to them, even if it is unlawful. Does that make sense?
Maggie, you share your time between the US and Australia. Do you see a distinction between the capacity of the world to see the humanity of George Floyd and what Amy's talking about we see the video of Ms Dhu crying for help. We see Tanya Day's children talking about their grief for their mother, and I don't know, does it cut through in the same way?
Well, I think what Sam's getting at is, like, what we're talking about here is racism. Like, ultimately, the system here in Australia and in the United States, it's deeply rooted in racism. Like, the system is racist. And there is not the community will, and therefore there is not the political will to put these changes in place. Like, we know the recommendations have been given to us as to what can be done to help prevent these deaths, to help prevent these families from not having their loved ones around anymore. And yet, nothing has been done. And so to my mind, you know, that the only reason for that can only possibly be racism, and that is the core of what we need to deal with. And certainly in the United States, where I normally live, like it is slowly but surely that is a discussion that's being had quite openly, and people are having to say, do you know what, I've made a mistake, and maybe in the past I've had conscious or unconscious bias that is racist, and I need to actively work against that. And I don't know if that conversation's happening here. And I think that all of us need to have a long, hard look at ourselves and our biases and think, is that racist? And if it is, what can we do as individuals to shift that conversation in our family, in our friendship group, and in the broader community? Because until that happens, we're going to keep seeing these tragedies that are inexcusable. It's not acceptable that is happening in this day and age.
Amy, 1991, you know, you've made the point powerfully before. It really felt like a moment, didn't it? Royal Commission report, Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission report, big reports, you know, big movement for change. And here we are, we're about to note the 30th anniversary of that report. Can I ask you, where do you get your strength from as you tell these horrendous and violent stories? Where do you get your strength from?
I really get it from the strength and resistance from Aboriginal men, women and children, because, I mean, I just wanted to also find a way to mention one of the inquests in the Northern Territory which happened, which is a really horrendous case of family violence. And the NT coroner looked into 2 cases in which Aboriginal women had lost their lives, and the way the police had not investigated and in fact had helped compound the violence. But Kumanjay Murphy, one of the women, she made several strong statements in her victim impact statement, and they were just strong shows of resistance, how she knew that if this kept going on, that, you know, she was likely to pass away, and she was so worried about her children. And there are so many, you know, when Aboriginal women die, they're seen just as bodies, and bodies that are unworthy of mourning. But I get my strength from the fact I believe that, you know, in their lives and in their deaths, they showed incredibly strong resistances, and they enacted forms of sovereignty and in presence on their own country and in their own terms. And so for me, it's not a question of that you can't fight or you can't continue to listen and you can't keep advocating. You know, we have to. We have a responsibility not only to our communities, to our families, but also to our ancestors. And I think so many other Aboriginal women are driven by that.
That strength that those people had enduring those horrible, almost unimaginable circumstances. Are you saying that that's not only a trauma, but their endurance and their spirit is a source of strength for you?
I think so, because I think so often Aboriginal women are spoken of solely in relation to their wounds, and that's definitely how it's sensationalised in the media, and then those wounds are misused politically and also in the media. But there are things that they would say. There were strong resistances against multiple layers of violence throughout their lives that, you know, we see in children. You know, people like April Watson and the Auntie Tanya Day's family, her daughters who just fought so hard for justice, you know, they are living embodiments of their mother's, you know, resistance in life. And so I find that really inspiring, and it just shows me that we don't have, you know, the luxury to ignore or to stop fighting to try and, you know, I don't know what justice would look like, but fighting for justice in a sense.
Well said. Thanks, Amy. And if this topic has raised any issues for you, and I know it has for so many people, this program, please call Lifeline 131114 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636. Did you know this? For the first time in nearly a year, Australia's domestic borders are all completely open. Western Australia has eased restrictions, with Victoria overnight making it the first time. WA has had no quarantine requirements for any state or territory since April. It will be welcome news for the government, who last week launched a stimulus package aimed at getting Australians travelling domestically. But that will be the limit of any travel for most of us for a while. The biosecurity emergency powers that enable the government to place restrictions on overseas flights have been extended until at least June. I have so many questions. What's going on, Sam Maiden? Where is the vaccine Can we start clearing our throat and
I
saying
was
that
still got
now?
a big smile on my face when you're saying all the borders are open. There's
They
a
are
carnivale
open.
atmosphere.
We could go anywhere on this continent.
Anywhere that we wanted,
Yes.
as long as we stayed in Australia. It
That's
is so
it.
incredibly exciting. What a time to be alive. Look, in relation to the vaccine, I think that the Prime Minister is still sticking to the script that he wants to get the majority of people vaccinated by the end of October. I think there's a lot of people scratching their heads and going, well, how's that going to be possible? Because there's been a bit of slowness in the initial rollout, particularly in aged care facilities. They say in part that is because there's been more questions than they expected from families about whether...
Really? Is that really? My only question is, where is the vaccine?
Saying.
That is my question.
That's what they're saying. But look, once the rubber hits the road, you know, we've got the AstraZeneca, all the rest of it. Look, we'll wait and see. There will always be people that criticise. I do a little bit on the side of optimism that we live in a country where we haven't had the same impact of COVID that we've had elsewhere, and we do have the vaccine rolled out. Clearly, some people aren't happy with the speed and dexterity with which that has been conducted, and no doubt the Prime Minister will continue to field questions in this regard.
And Maggie, you travel between Australia and the United States, so you kind of live in both countries. Well, mainly you live in the United States, and you have been able to travel freely.
Well, so I actually had COVID all the way back in March.
Oh, did you?
And
How was that?
Look, I had it mildly, so very fortunate, and I'm here to tell the tale, so that's good. But I had to come back for a funeral, and so it's interesting now leaving the country to go back to the United States. The process to leave the country is quite extensive. You've got to apply, you've got to prove that you've got a lease, you've got a bank account, all these kinds of things.
So you can go if you're based somewhere else.
Yes.
But if you're stuck overseas and you want to come home, that's a different matter.
Yeah, I got lucky. I booked a flight. I just got lucky that mine left to be able to get back here. So I was very fortunate for whatever reason. My flight just left. But yeah, so to leave the country, there's no issue getting a flight out. I could fly out back to New York City any day of the week that I chose. There's plenty of flights. So I'm not sure. Maybe they're freight. I'm not quite sure why there's so many of them. But it seems to be no issue getting out of the country. The issue is getting the approval from DFAT to leave the country. And you can only do that, as I understand it, if you are already a resident or already have a life overseas and you were just back in Australia temporarily.
And is it very... We're running out of time, but it must be weird to come between here and the US. I mean,
it's quite delightful to be here. I don't have to wear a mask when I go for a run. It's quite amazing, you know. I don't have to wear a mask when I go out to dinner. And it's interesting, actually, when I get back to the US, I'm at the bottom of the list for the vaccination because I'm relatively young and I've had COVID and stuff. But I will apparently have a vaccine by June, July in the US. So they're saying that most of the population should be sorted by the summer, which is exciting.
By the northern summer?
But yes.
Is there a point, where we are nearly out of time, where we're going to need to accept more risk, where a certain amount of the population is going to be immunised, maybe the most vulnerable, the oldest people, Indigenous communities, and we go, OK, all right, let's open the borders. Universities are going to...
Well, universities are going to be so excited about the opening of the borders for all sorts of reasons. You know, we've talked at length about, you know, the pipeline issues that we've got with international students, as well as with our own research abilities at the moment. So we are a little bit hamstrung. But there will be a time when we've got a larger proportion of the Australian community that is vaccinated and inoculated. There will be a time when we'll be able to look back at this time and say, well, COVID just does the rounds like the rest of the usual seasonal influenzas. Okay. And yes, we'll still have to have our annual jabs with the quaternary vaccines in them that will allow us to have some sort of protection. So it'll become business as usual in time, but we have to not let go of hand washing, wearing masks and just being sensible.
Yeah, OK, I will. That is all we have time for. Sorry, we ran out of time there, Amy. Thanks so much for your contribution. And to Lisa Jackson-Pulver, Maggie Palmer, Sam Maiden and Amy Maguire. Wonderful speaking tonight and wonderful points. Thanks so much for being part of it and bearing witness to those injustices in the Aboriginal community. So important to have those conversations. Jules is in tomorrow night. Have a great night. Good night to you.